trying the camera.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Joanne Britton, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the bucket class this morning. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to remind you of a few things. Turn on your T-coil if that applies to you. Please turn off your cell phone and put it away so it won't be a distraction for anyone. And when we get to the point of asking questions, I will come around with the microphone, and please wait to ask your question until you can speak into the microphone and introduce yourself first so we all know who it is that's asking the question, if you would be so kind. So this morning, we are very happy to welcome Leslie Gregg-Jolly, who is Professor of Biology at Grinnell College, and she will be speaking to us this morning on racism by genetics. Leslie.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay? The first thing I'll point out is you have a white card and a yellow card. The yellow card is for you to write any questions that you might have for me that you would like me to look at break and possibly answer after break. So you can just have these available to you. And then the white card is for a secret activity we'll do in a few minutes. So I've been at Grinnell about 25 years, which I've heard is a shorter period of time than many of you. It's very nice for me to see some friendly faces and colleagues. And I've done lots of, over the years, many kinds of talks in the community at the Mayflower, ACES, the colleges, Alumni College. This is my first bucket course talk. And I'm doing something different that I've never done before, so we'll see how it goes. And the different thing I'm doing today, this is the first time I'm giving a talk that's not about my research. This is a talk about a topic that I think is important and interesting and something that I've been working on learning about at Grinnell for almost 25 years. And I'm very lucky because Grinnell, being a small liberal arts college, we're all kind of stuck in there, right? So even though I'm in a fancy new science building in Noyes, I work very closely with faculty throughout the college and other disciplines. And I have opportunities to learn from them and about their expertise. And sometimes I even get extra money for these opportunities. So a lot of interdisciplinary work has been funded at the college. Because honestly, that's not that well. We get rewarded at the college based on the quality of our teaching and research for the most part. So if you're expanding out into something interdisciplinary that's not quite related to your research, it can be good for students, but it doesn't necessarily make you a stronger teacher or a stronger researcher. Although I think it does, but that's a philosophical question, I think. So at any rate, so I'm grateful for some of the funding that's been made available to me through the college's resources, through the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and through the Mellon Foundation. And these faculty development activities, I linked after a few of them up with anthropologist Professor Katja Meverak, and she's pictured here. And the bulk of the talk that I'm giving is drawn from a course that I co-teach with Katja called Racing Through Genetics. And this is a 200-level course that applies to biology majors and anthropology majors and American Studies concentrators. Concentrators are interdisciplinary kind of minors at the college, for those of you not familiar with that system. And I'm also grateful, so in my research is focused on how bacteria can handle DNA damage. And I'm interested in things like gene expression, how genes get used by organisms, how they get turned on and off, and things like that. I'm a biologist, though, but I'm not a population geneticist or evolutionary biologist. So again, I'm very lucky to work with a great evolutionary biologist, Jackie Brown. And he has also helped me through the years to become a better population geneticist and evolutionary biologist for these purposes. And I also thank you for being here and giving me this opportunity. And also the great staff of the bucket course. I just feel pampered to death this morning, and I'm grateful. And I just think this is a really fantastic program to be open to the community. Thank you so much for inviting me to come today. Okay. So you might have been reading the news this week. You might have seen this thing about some woman who's been called Pocahontas by somebody. And then she took the bait, I guess, and she went and got an ancestry DNA test done. Okay, so some of you might have even done them. There's popular companies, 23andMe is one of the more popular ones. And typically you take a little cheek swab with some, get some cheek cells, and you put it in a little tube, and you send it off, and the molecular biologists manipulate it, and they come up with some DNA sequences. Those are sequence of A's and C's and G's and T's, and they compare certain regions of the customer's DNA to some regions of DNA that are known to vary, associated with different populations throughout the world, and they'll come up with some scheme for you. In the private industry, what they do is fairly protected, so you can't really know. You might talk more about that later. Okay? Elizabeth Warren actually contacted a research lab and had hers done through that, so that everything was very transparent of exactly what they were doing, what markers they were using, and how the analysis was done. And it caused some controversy. So it came out that, yeah, it looks like some generations back she did have somebody, you know, in her family lore, right? She knew that one of her ancestors was a Native American, and then she thought, okay, I'll get the DNA test to prove it. Prove it. How do you know? I don't know. Let's talk about that. So from an article in the Times last week, the American public doesn't understand the difference between ancestry and tribal membership, said Kim Tallbear, a professor at the University of Alberta. While many people see Native American as simply a racial category, she said, we have additional ideas about how to identify when one is Native American that aren't really consistent with the way most Americans think. Our definitions matter to us. So what's some of the vocabulary at play here? Definitions? Definitions of what? Racial category. Based on just this quote, what do you think Kim Tallbear means by racial category? Let's think about that a little bit. The public doesn't understand the difference between ancestry and tribal membership. So, you know, we're people, we're social. We like to know, where do we belong? Who are our people? How can we figure out, how do these ideas factor into the identities that we have? So we'll be talking about these sorts of issues. So, to get us talking, get ready for the secret exercise. You're going to need a pen, and you're going to try to write neatly. You will not, your answers should be anonymous. Okay? So I would like you to write, 1, how do you describe your race or ethnicity? 2, how sure are you about that? 100%, I know it. Maybe not. How do you know? How do you know what your racial or ethnic category is? And 4th, if you have time, why do you think it matters? I think we have some extra pens if you... Okay, good for you. Perseverance. So, how would you categorize yourself? How sure are you? How do you know? And why do you think it matters? Everybody have at least the first 3 done? Need more time? Okay, now's the hard, tricky part. This is a way I find to get audiences engaged in a subject that might be difficult for some to talk about or touchy. So a lot of people are fearful to talk about racial categories for fear of being labeled as a racist. And that scene has a lot of moral judgment in our society. So that's why I try to give some people anonymity. That's the idea with your question cards on the yellow and then the white cards for sharing this. So, you ready? This is how we're going to make this anonymous. Those of you who feel like it, I'm going to ask you to stand up and move around, and we'll help the people who don't feel like getting up. And the only thing is, you have to exchange a card 5 times. Okay? So count them. You need to get your hands on 5 different cards. So, so some of you might need to move around a little bit for this, and then we'll help. And so the deal is we need to change 5 times.
2. Really got to change. 16. 3. 4. Okay, I think I went 3. I'm all done.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Okay? I need to get 2. You're doing good. Here, I'll train one. I'm going to do one more mix way in the back of the room.
I've done 5.
I need to mix up the one in the back of the room here.
I've done 5. You got yours back after 6.
Okay, do you think you've touched 5 different cards probably?
Yeah.
Okay, now we have a microphone that can circulate, right?
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to ask somebody to volunteer to read what is on your card. Not what you wrote on the card, to read what is on the card.
Okay, my card says for 1, Irish, German. For 2, how sure are you? Pretty sure. How do you know? Family stories and research. And why do you think it matters? It doesn't or shouldn't.
Okay, let's have another.
Okay, number 1 is Caucasian. I checked that box because I was asked and had to check something. 2, fairly sure. 3, based on the ancestors, relatives that I know about. 4, I do not think it matters except if I need to know for medical reasons.
Someone else?
Number 1 is Caucasian. Number 2, quite sure. 3, for my, in parentheses, limited knowledge of ancestry. 4, I don't think it matters except for census kind of data collection.
I'm giving you a workout. Thank you very much.
Jewish Eastern European, very sure, family, matters for housing.
So I'm guessing that's an allusion to one of 2 things, either wanting to have segregated housing, or it could be related to, somebody mentioned check the box, and that was likely referring to, we do have U.S. Census categories, and we take the census, and on the census you have to check a box, and Caucasian, as the card filler outer indicated, is one of the boxes to check. And why would we have a census? We could have a whole talk about that. But basic answer is if you want to track discrimination, you need to know who's who to see if a certain group is given unfair advantage or disadvantage over another group. Let's have one or two more.
Okay, number 1 is white. 2 is 95%. 3 is because of records of ancestors on 3 sites going back many generations, and the 4th going back maybe 4 generations. And for number 4, I doubt that it does.
One more.
1 is Caucasian, 2 is family lore, in quotes, and skin color. 2 is 100%, and then 3 is family lore. 4 is advantage in society, personally don't care, and then in parentheses, with the country moving the way it seems to be, I'm somewhat ashamed to be white.
Interesting. How many people have someone in their family, by any means, who you think would categorize themselves differently than you categorize yourself? So I'm seeing almost half of the audience. So let's think about that when we think of family to define our race. And a lot of people talked about ancestry, and we'll talk about that as well. And the grand finale of the talk is why it matters. So one thing I will tell you is I put this talk together. I've been teaching for 25 years, as I've said. I've never run out of anything to say, but I'm always nervous before every talk. So especially in the later half of the talk, I have lots of little side stories that I could leave out or not. So don't be nervous for me if you hear me saying, oh, I'm going to skip that, I'm going to skip that. Just a little heads up. So let's get some kind of vocabulary straight. Okay? So from that quote from Tall Bear, if you remember, she, I think she identifies as a she, talked about racial category, ancestry. What do people mean? We mean it differently than we think most Americans mean it. This is very true with vocabulary around racial categories. A word that you won't be hearing me use today, unless I slip up by accident because I grew up in the society, is actually the word race. And I'll make a case for that throughout the talk. Okay? But think about what race means to you. I guarantee you it would mean something different to other people in this room. We don't have time to do that exercise, but we could do that exercise. So it's a word that people think everybody means the same thing by, but in fact, we don't. Okay? Ethnicity is similar. Okay? So most people, and so just to show my cards, based literally, the white cards. So most people associate race with some sort of ancestry, some sort of biological trait. Most people associate ethnicity with something kind of cultural, how you were raised, perhaps. The truth is, ethnicity was kind of meant, as my understanding by the anthropologists, to kind of replace race, to reflect the cultural thing. And what's happened is, for the most part, they're used interchangeably. To the point that our census categories now, Hispanic or Latinx, is used as a ethnic category, whereas Caucasian African American is used as a racial category, and that's to be in line with Hispanic, meaning it's populations from all over the world, so it can't really fit the way most people think of as a racial category, even though many people would identify Hispanic as a race. Okay, so they're kind of confounded, and confusing, I might add. Ancestry. Okay. So most people mean ancestry, who begot who begot who begot who, and most people mean biological ancestry. Okay, so we know throughout time, people have raised children who are not theirs biologically, okay? But when we talk about ancestry, most people mean who your biological ancestors were, okay? Now we have ways of testing that, historically not. And historically, I guarantee you there's ancestry mixes up that nobody admitted, but that's again another story, okay? So tribal membership, okay, that's what came in with the story with Elizabeth Warren. Okay, so the Native American community came down and said, but it doesn't mean you're part of our tribe, because they have other criteria for that. Okay, it's not having a snippet of DNA that might be associated with being Native American. Okay, and so they were quick to point out that that tribal membership can't be revealed by a DNA test. Okay, it's a social thing that they do with registries and ancestries and being part of the group. So a lot of times, how do we know that we belong? How do we know that who our people are? Okay, so family lore, I like somebody had that in quotes, right? So who your people are might have nothing to do with who your biological ancestors are. It could be kind of who you're raised with, who you hang out with, who seems synonymous with you, with your culture. Inheritance, okay, so you can inherit money, right? You can inherit DNA. So people are usually talking about these sorts of terms. They're often talking about inheriting DNA. But they could be talking about inheriting cultural values or practices as well. And finally, so these terms are, I'm really on familiar ground. Genotype and phenotype. This is where I live, okay? So your genotype is your sequence of DNA. I mean, you're made up of A's and C's and G's and T's. You can remember those letters because I'm at Grinnell College, AT-GC. And we have most of our sequences of A's and C's and G's and T's are the same between any two of us, but there are some places where we might vary, okay? And there are some places where groups of us might vary, okay? So that's the genotype. That's a sequence of A's and C's and G's and T's, basically. And that's your biological inheritance. That's the stuff of biological inheritance, for the most part, okay? The phenotype is a physical trait, okay? So that's like what you might, we'll talk about a phenotype of skin color. Okay, that's what you see. It's any measurable trait is a phenotype. So it's kind of how those genes get used. Okay, this is like actually one thing I'm doing, every talk I've ever given I say this, so I feel I'm really familiar grounds here. Any phenotype that you can measure is not just a product of the genotype, it's also a product of the environment. Okay? And usually it's complicated for how you get to a particular phenotype. Okay, so we'll talk about that. People think of phenotypes as being things that are changeable, right? It's where the rubber hits the road with interactions of environment and genotype. Having a particular gene set only gives you part of the pathway to any given phenotype. Okay? Any questions? Yes?
Would the genotype, the phenotype include accents?
Would the phenotype include accents? If you had a way to measure it, it could. Yep. You just need a way to measure it.
What else would be included in?
A phenotype? Anything you can think of that you can measure. Hair color. Some people think they can measure intelligence. Again, you have a way, you could just use some sort of test score. That would be a phenotype. I'm trying to be creative here and I'm not coming up with much. Anything that you can measure that people can, physical traits, or even a behavioral trait that you can have a way that you can measure. And believe me, almost for traits that are thought to be associated with racial categories, they've all been measured ad nauseum. Okay, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So I just want to point out that vocabulary matters, and be careful that people are really talking about the same thing when they use some of these words. And if I confuse you today, please feel free to raise your hand and interrupt me, and I would be happy to clarify. Okay, so this was my warm-up. I am going to be skipping a lot of slides. So basically, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today relates to newer, this is how I got into it as a molecular biologist, newfangled ways of sequencing DNA. We can do it really fast and cheap now. It's to the effect where it's actually more expensive to store a person's DNA sequence than it is to actually determine it. So there's lots of new data. We're learning more about genetic variation. And we're trying to associate genetic variation with traits, phenotypes that we can measure. So we can look at things genome-wide. Okay, that's a new thing. We can look at all of the A's and C's and G's and T's in all of your cell, like like all of your DNA now, and you can compare it to all of somebody else's DNA. And we can put people in groups. So some people, you could take a family that seems to have a high rate of breast cancer compared to a family that seems to have a low rate of breast cancer, and see, are there certain sequences that are associated in the family that tends to get breast cancer that doesn't seem to be found in the other group? Okay, so that's a lot of research that's going on now related to genetics. And with this research, some people are turning back to this, 2-century looking for biological essentialism related to race. Okay, so we'll be talking about that. And then the last thing, as I said, we'll talk about some biological effects of racism. Okay, so here's some of the take-home messages. This is the outline for my talk today. First, I'm going to talk about what racial categories that we use and talk about change in space and time. So if you want to talk about race as a thing, you have to think about that, because it changes. Like, how do you make sense of that? Okay, so at one point in time in one place, it means this. At another point in time in another place, it might mean that. Okay. Second, people like to think that people in one racial category have a set of genes that determines that, and people in another racial category have a different set of genes. That is not true. We'll talk about some of the evidence for that. Not only is that differentiation not true, there's also no criteria for a subspecies among the modern humans. Okay? So there's not enough difference between groups to bring it to a level of a subspecies as it would be when you're studying other organisms in nature. Okay? And by the way, we are living organisms, in case I didn't make that clear. Okay? So we do follow kind of the laws and theories of biology. And then, since in our day of age, skin color is often used as a determining trait for a racial group, I'm going to address some of the recent work on that specifically. And again, detailed analysis of the genetics of skin color don't align with racial categories. And skin color, by the way, is kind of a complicated phenotype. We'll look at that in a minute. And while genetics does not determine a person's racial category, there are biological effects of racism. Now this said, I put these words on a slide. I think it seems kind of simple. In fact, this is very hard. And it's hard because we are taught ideas about racism starting very young and throughout our ways in different parts of our lives. So things are represented to us in certain ways that reinforce our ideas about racial categories. And I'll point, if I have time, at least a couple examples out about that. Okay. So this is, again, why you're welcome to ask questions on your cards if you don't want to interrupt. So first, racial and ethnic categories change in the U.S. about every 10 years. Okay, so we talked about checking boxes on the census. What those census categories have changed throughout the history of the country, and kind of before, well, no, not really. Since 1790, I guess this is data that's kind of fun to look at if you're interested, looking at the census.gov. I know that all you see are a bunch of colored boxes. That's okay, but notice that the colors change over time, and some of the words are changing in the boxes as well. Okay? So if somebody was categorizing a racial group, 50 years ago, they would be using different criteria, different groups than they would be now. So it changes. And then some assignment of racial groups through time in the country has been left up to the states. So there has been periods of time where an individual could walk across a state line and their racial group would change. No kidding. Okay? So it changes in space. Another evidence of this, again, hearkening, looking to DNA to have all the answers. So in Brazil, they did a study where they asked people, how do you categorize yourself? Okay, what do you think your race is? And they would categorize themselves into groups that could be brought into whites, browns, and blacks. Okay? So with those people, they took a DNA sample and sequenced their DNA. And what you see in this figure, so for these people who categorized themselves as white, they looked at their DNA and they had some markers that are associated with African ancestry. Okay? And the amount of those markers are shown on the y-axis. Okay? So white people had this much variation of African ancestry. Okay? Browns had this much variation, and blacks had this much variation. Okay? So as you can tell, it overlaps, right? So could you say to have this much amount of these African genes, you will be in that race? No, so it doesn't really work. Then it gets, another interesting thing that they did is they compared this to some people in the South, I think they used southern US samples, who identified as black. So again, they asked some people in the US, what's your racial category? If they said black or African American, they'd take their DNA and they'd sequence it. And it turns out that for the most part, white Brazilians have more African markers than black US citizens. Okay, so where do these racial categories? So people tend to think kind of 5 racial categories these days. One of them that you mentioned, that most people in this room would probably identify, is Caucasian. Where did this word come? The way that people use Caucasian now, I think most people who use the word Caucasian are trying to be polite instead of saying white. They feel like then it's scientific and I'm not being racial. The truth is the opposite, to be honest, but I appreciate the effort. So Caucasian was invented by this man, Blumenbach. Okay, and he kind of did his thesis work, and then he revised it, and then he revised it, and ultimately a lot of his work was used looking at skull structure, okay, and size, and he identified 5 groups. So he had skulls from people from different areas of the world and identified them in these groups, which pretty much mapped this idea of continental racial categories that most of us have learned today, especially in the US. And a couple interesting things of Blumenbach. He was also, in those days, they thought everybody started in Asia, so they thought that human evolution started in Asia. And then there was also a degenerative hypothesis that kind of all races were really Caucasian, but due to sun or environmental factors, they became different colors. Black or yellowish or brown. But what's interesting about Blumenbach, you could say he's the father of racism, but not really, because he did say he thought it was a matter of opportunity. That races could be any other races in the right environment. Okay? That's very different than thinking that it relies in the genotype or relies in something that's immutable or can't change. So those are some features of Blumenbach. Since then, oh, one other thing I wanted to say is this was very timely. So there was a time, 1700s, 1800s, where it started with Linnaeus. There was this huge era of trying to categorize everything. It's where biology taxonomy started, and people were really interested in labeling things, identifying things, and then to make sense of it, right, we try to put groups together. So we still use this system today, where our species is Homo sapiens, okay? And, we're mammals. Some of you learned this in school. We use the binomial nomenclature started by Linnaeus, which is our genus and species, because that's the most specific categorization that we have. Okay? So lots of people in this age were trying to categorize. Okay? Since Blumenbach, okay, literally almost every part or substance in the human body has been used to try to map racial groups. Okay? Skin, bone, blood. Okay? Some of my blood favorite work is done by an author named Tapper. So there were studies, so some of you have heard of sickle cell anemia. Okay? It's where red blood cells actually form sickles. Okay? And you can look at that under the microscope. So they had physicians in the early 1900s, I think. They had some people who, and they associated with African ancestry. In fact, if you look at the map of where these genes that are associated with sickle cell are, it's just close to the equator. So usually you'll see a picture, because we teach racism, right, where you've got the Africa map around the equator. There's other places around the equator where you'll see these genes associated with sickle cell anemia show up. But anyway, you had these physicians looking at slides in the 1800s, early 1900s of blood. So they're looking in the microscope and they're seeing sickling, but sometimes it was in a white person. Oh my God. So this literature they wrote, it says, well, it looks sickled, but if you look at it really carefully, it's sickled like this, not that. It didn't really make sense. And oh, this person looks white, and then they like to play in the Mediterraneans. Like maybe there was a Greek back there or something, and who knows where they came from in the culture of the time. So again, you'll see acrobatics. So they kind of went through blood, hair, and bone. Guess what? Nothing ever worked. Okay? I couldn't define this person in this racial category and that person in that racial category. It never worked. So I know. Pop into the lab. The DNA must have the answer. So it's just we haven't looked at the right trait yet. We know that we're so sure that these racial groups are right and real, even though it didn't work for any of the phenotypes that we looked at. Okay? We're going to look at the DNA now, because that's really where our ancestry comes, and that's where it has to be. What time is our break?
20 minutes till.
Okay. So I'll get started on this next thing. So I'm going to cut to the punchline, because I might lose a few of you with some of the data that I'm going to show. But I just want to be clear. There's no basis for genetic differentiation between racial groups, and there's no basis to have subspecies of modern humans. And the best articulation of these ideas I've seen is by an evolutionary biologist who's, I think at WashU, definitely in Missouri, Alan Templeton, and I'll show you some of his work. But basically, so people are living organisms, like I said. Let's look at them using, say, techniques associated with the Endangered Species Act. Okay? We need to kind of identify things. How do we study this? Okay? So one thing is there, like, if we find the right gene, could we just do a gene test? Say everybody who has this form of the gene, we categorize as African American, and everybody who has that form of the gene, we categorize as Caucasian. That would be great, right? There's no such gene. Okay? So then we could start looking kind of at frequencies. Well, but where's the cutoff? Okay? And so they've done work like that that I'll talk about. The other way to look at a subspecies is not by genetic differentiation that I just described, but by common ancestry. So like who begot who begot who. Maybe there's really not that much difference in the DNA sequences that we can't determine, but if we look ancestrally, we can see people in this racial group have a different pattern of ancestry than people in that racial group. Okay. So he did the work and used the work of lots of others to corroborate it. And basically, if you look at groups of humans, and again, the popular racial myth I'll say is that there's 5 groups of humans, you could account for maybe of the little bit of difference there is between humans. And when I say little bit of difference, there's less than, we're talking maybe like 3 to 5% max of differences that could be associated with groups. So he broke it down and found a level of genetic differentiation of 4.3%. The definition used biologically is that you have to have a difference of 25% or greater to be a subspecies. Not a species, but a subspecies. So humans don't make that cut. Contrary, if you do chimp subspecies, there's actually some legitimate subspecies of chimps. Okay? So there's not that level of genetic difference. And secondly, he looked at the evolutionary lineages, who beget who beget who, and there's no clear lines. And let's see. Should we take a break now?
Sure.
Okay, so let's take a break and come back at 10 after. 10 till. No, not 10 after. You don't get that much time off, students. And again, if you have any questions on those yellow cards that you want to turn in, I'll try to get to them. Thank you. Off with this graph. And again, we're on the y-axis is how much different there is genetically between groups. And the x-axis is how far away people could be. So what, if there were distinct groups of people, something like a subspecies, and we put this data on this, I put it behind the big red square. If there were distinct groups, what kind of shapes do you think there might be in the data? I have an answer back there.
That way.
So you think the further geographical distance, then you're going to see more genetic differentiation. So you're going to see a trend, an upward trend. Okay, somebody says they don't think so. Do you think that if there was an upward trend, do you think that would be different if there were distinct groups versus if there weren't distinct groups? So the answer is you would expect something different. What might that look like? So distinct, right, means that you'd be able to identify some people in one group and not in another group. So you might expect some breaks in the data. So you'd be able to group people. So you might find clusters. Does that make sense? Okay. So if there's distinct groups, you'd expect to see clusters. Okay, if you've been paying attention, what do you think you're going to see next? Here's the data. It's linear response. Okay. So again, the further apart populations are, the more genetic difference you might see. But again, there's not like a cutoff where if you're over here and then you go over there, there's no big difference. It's just over. But if you're really far away, then you might see a difference, but you just keep moving that difference and you see the same difference. Okay. Now I want to talk about how some of the data gets used. I'm getting to the part where I can skip some things if I want to. So again, these ancestral informative markers that are being used in these, what's called, some people are calling recreational genomics to look at your ancestry, but also some things that are being used by biologists as well. So what happens is you take samples of DNA and then you analyze it, okay? And you look and see, we have some markers we think are associated with this population, we have some markers we think are associated with that population. I say we think are associated because it is a probabilistic model, because what do we have? We don't have one sequence that's determinative for any population. But there's probabilities. There are differences in how many people overall in a population might be likely to have one form of a gene versus another. Okay? So what I want to talk to you about this idea, is sampling. Okay? So that means if I want to sample this audience, maybe I'll take DNA from 10 people. Okay? And if I want to do the US, maybe then I'll sample some people in Colorado. So you could think of these circles as people in Grinnell, people in Colorado. What about all the people in between? What happens in Nebraska? Okay. So depending on kind of where and how you sample, how your data looks might be different. Okay. So maybe the Iowans do look different than the Coloradans. Okay. But that difference might be, and if I just group you all together, right, you'd be like dark blue in this and purple in the other. Okay? So, but that could be misleading, because then you could think that you have blue people in Iowa and purple people in Colorado. Okay? When the reality is it's a climb. Okay? Meaning that there's gradual changes. That's like that slope of that line that we just look at, it increasing geographical differences. So the big point of this is the Klein versus cluster model. When you're talking about distinct populations of people, you have to be really careful about how the sampling was done. Okay? And you'll see some of the models are changing as we get more and more samples. Guess where most of the samples early on came from? US and Europe, or US people reporting European history. Africa was grossly underrepresented. Okay, so that really skewed what some of the data look like. If you're sampling a small proportion, they're more likely to look alike. Okay? But as you get more and more people, it seems to be getting closer and closer to this climb. Just this picture is just Africa, and it's showing where you get this variation, even within one continent. So they make these pictures called structure analysis, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but here is this array, okay, goes around the world, okay, from west to east, and each vertical line is an individual, okay? And so they sampled populations from these areas of the world, and then you can kind of do something almost like painting chromosomes and say, oh, it looks like they have this many markers associated with this population and that many markers associated with that population. associated with, right? Remember I said that again? Did I say with that population? No, I said likely associated with. I think I forgot the likely. Okay, so it's a probabilistic model. So what they do then are these diagrams with inferred ancestral populations. This is the big myth. The big myth that we're taught again and again and again is that, okay, once upon a time, most people believe the out of Africa hypothesis now, so there were some people who evolved like people in Africa, and then they went out and populated the world, and then once they got to these other places, they stayed there. There was no more coming and going, and then they evolved really important traits over time, and that was pure. And then something happened, maybe around colonization times, where we started having mixing, okay, or some people would say admixture. The idea being that you had people from one population breeding with the people from another population and then mixing in that admixture, okay? So there's this idea that there are these pure populations designated by a solid color circle here, okay? This is a myth. These populations never exist. There's always been messing around between borders. So keep that in mind. Does this give a theoretical framework that can help some things? Maybe. Okay. The number of these ancestral populations varies. Okay. It's called K in the business, in this, this software is called structure. So there's not like a known number. Sometimes if you tell it there's 5, then you get really pretty data. But that's an assumption that you're putting into it. Then there's ways now, there's new software where you can try to get it to tell you what the K value is, how many of these populations are. Guess what? When you increase the sample size, K tends to go up. And when you increase the sample size, see how you've got this big chunk for Europe? It gets more complicated than that. And then you have to be really careful. Even with, I said there's mixing around borders, there's a little bit of Native American purple up there in Russia. That's kind of hard to imagine, but whatever. So again, these are models, okay? People are taking these as fact. You put assumptions in. You often will get the same assumption out that you put in. Fancy that. Okay? So just being careful about that. I guess I have time to do this. This I put in light of the Elizabeth Warren thing. So another thing to think about when we're looking at DNA. So when you think of ancestry, right, I think of myself and my parents. And I got half of my DNA from my mother and half of my DNA from my father. And then I think of my grandparents. So I think of myself as having 25% of my DNA from each grandparent. That's not quite exactly right. And if you go back, it's even more not quite exactly back. So realize that your genetic ancestry is a little bit different than your people ancestry. Okay? So this picture is what it would look like if it was perfect, right? So there's me in the middle, there's my parents, there's my 4 grandparents, biological grandparents, okay? Upright, and then it each gets sliced in half every time, out to 8 generations. Okay. So I just calculated double here, these percentages, right? So 25% from my grandparents, right? I get out to 6 generations, around 1.5%, okay? The reality is this. Gene ancestry is different than ancestry, and you can actually lose some markers from your ancestry. So it was famous when Oprah Winfrey took one of these tests, and she said, "I'm not Zulu." Okay, she could very well have Zulu ancestry. Okay, it just depends how it's done, and then this maybe, so she could really have Zulu DNA, and we don't know it, so I'll say that. But maybe she has a Zulu ancestor, a person who lived, right, who was a parent to one of her ancestors, but through so many generations it kind of got diluted out, if you will. Okay, so that's just a little food for thought for you. And then, so I talked about genetic, so I may or may not have convinced you that there's no absolute genetic differentiation between groups of people. And you can say, but I know that we went through these ancestral patterns, and I know that my ancestors came from this part of the world and throughout the lines. Okay, so that's kind of the evolutionary argument. And so this is a way, we call this phylogeny, looking at the history of evolution. And we often represent these with these trees. Okay, so think of a tree and branching. Okay? So to look at a phylogeny, you're looking at these lines, and when you see a point here, see how this carnivora comes off and forms two big branches in the tree? That means that right there, see that right there? That means that there's a common ancestor to all of these groups. But then it branched off, okay? And one branch went on to become things like cats and leopards, and another branch went on to form things like dogs and coyotes. Okay? And this is just a cartoon way of representing this, these phylogenetic trees. Okay? So the big thing is when you see a branch point, that's a common ancestor, and then it diverged. It accumulated mutations and became something different. So this is how we can look at the evolutionary tree. Again, there's a branch point that's a common ancestor, okay? And then at the end of the line, so today we would look at these different groups, okay? So you can see the groups say A, B, C here. You see that? Okay? Those have more in common with each other because they have this similar common ancestor than they have with the groups D, E, F. Okay? So you can say A is more different than D. Okay? So do human genetics show this? Oh, this is just the tree to emphasize. Again, once upon a time there was some cell in a puddle, and we all evolved from that. Okay, so people, okay, so here's a tree with people on it. Again, there's some common ancestor that all the primates, including us, came from. Okay, so we do have a common ancestor with orangutans. Unlike poor Darwin's wife, this doesn't mean that we evolved from chimpanzees. It means that we have a common ancestor with the chimpanzee. Okay? Then we get into modern humans, say around 200,000 years ago is when we think modern humans were here on the planet and went on the move. Okay? There are some ancient human groups called Denisovans. Any anthropologists here? No, I haven't. I'm not sure. This is recently, kind of discovered in the past 10 years. And Neanderthals. So these could possibly meet those criteria of subspecies that I talked about before. Nobody in modern humans does. But look at these red arrows I drew on this. What could that possibly mean? So that means there was some genetic exchange between these ancient peoples, okay, such that some modern humans are walking around with Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA within their genomes. That's just kind of interesting. Okay. So just quickly, the out of Africa hypothesis that people kind of evolved here and then they started inhabiting the rest of the world. And we see, this is actually well accepted, but there's some data that don't quite fall in it. So it looks like there were some other people in places around the world. Oh, did I lose? You guys don't have another pointer, do you? That there were some other people around the world earlier than what some of these years are. So there's a little bit of controversy now about the out of Africa hypothesis, but in terms of looking at modern genomes, there doesn't seem to be. Might just take more energy for the light. Okay, so when we look at trees, which isn't a good idea for people, but I like this example. So here we can, is a tree where we have sub-Saharan Africa, southern Africa. And you have one group of hunter-gatherers that seem to have some differences genetically from farmers in southern Africa. And that's depicted on this tree, okay? So you see, it looks like the farmers and everybody else to the right have a common ancestor. You see that dot? Yeah. Okay. So, but what if you want to draw the tree and you say, well, I just want to show that it has the 5 races that we all know exist. Then you would collapse the 2 sub-Saharan groups, right? Look at that! On the right. See, I told you race was biologically based. Okay. When in fact, there's people in sub-Saharan Africa known to share more ancestry with the people in Eurasia than other sub-Saharan Africans. Okay. Yeah, great. I'll try and... Okay, so just beware, when you see tree depictions of modern humans, beware. Okay? Because they imply something that's not real. Okay? They imply a clear line of descent. Okay? That just doesn't really exist. And people keep using it. Like, we use trees. You could do, like, you can draw these trees based on a given gene, you know? But then you do a different gene and it looks a little different. So when you're doing it for people, it just doesn't work. So beware if you're seeing that. And so some of the evidence against this is a little better. It's still a tree. So this is looking at the same thing. You've got common ancestry at the top, okay? Then you're coming down, and this has been shown. It looks like there's a lot more genetic diversity in Africa because there have been people there longer. Okay? There have been people in, say, North America for a shorter period of time, so there's less genetic variation. By the way, when I say less genetic variation, let's say maybe pre-colonialization, I'll give you that. I mean, do these tests now and it's, you know, all over the world. So, but I want to point something out here. Do you see these horizontal lines? But the tree is like who begat who begat who had who had who had who had. But then you have these horizontal lines. What does that mean? Well, that's where there's some DNA from this line coming from that line. That might have come from that line. So these horizontal lines, we actually call this horizontal gene transfer. Okay? So it's kind of mixing between the lines, which defies the value of the tree, right? And so Alan Templeton says it's a trellis, it's not a tree, when you look at this, okay? So he depicts that. So the genetic information indicates that lines have not been evolving independently, okay? So racial groups don't make that. There's no evidence of these splits where you have this group population evolving independently of that population. There's just not, the data don't support that. And none of the statistical analyses of genetic differentiation between human populations supports a tree structure. So beware of trees. For humans, for people. You could see a gene, that would be fair, but then you do a different gene and it will look different. So, okay, but let's go to skin color, because like we know that that's really what works for our racial categories, right? Don't believe anything else I say. Well, she says this genetic blue. What does that mean? But it's skin color. So, a research lab went and tackled this. Well, first, a little bit about skin color. So skin color is what we call an adaptive trait, okay? It evolves adaptive traits like adapt, or like adapting to the environment, right? So usually that means that there's some selective pressure for that trait to evolve or come to be and get fixed into population in that area. So adaptive traits are things like skin colors, things that interact with the environment, digestion, enzymes involved in digestion, immune system, right? Because that could be very regional. What pathogens do you interact with? Okay, so these are where you might see the most variability between people, are things encoding, genes encoding adaptive traits, okay? So these are fairly fast evolving, if you will. Complex traits, like behavioral traits, intelligence, those are really old, okay? Those took a long time to evolve, and those are really old. Adaptive traits are relatively new. So some people want to use an adaptive trait. You know, I don't really care what people's skin color are, but I want to be able to categorize people by how smart they are. So if I know if they've this skin color, they're smarter than those. Well, no, that doesn't make any sense at all for many, many reasons. Okay? One of them is that skin color evolved since things like intelligence. Okay. That's good enough for that. Okay, so this group, Tishkoff's group, okay, just went at it with the new sequences. Skin color actually is a fairly complex genetic tree. Okay? And before this work, we didn't even know what genes affect skin color. We knew a few, but we knew that we didn't know the whole story. So earlier I told you about these genome-wide association studies that are interesting to people. So they went throughout Africa, okay, and they scientifically measured the phenotype of how much melanin is in the skin. And then they would collect the DNA samples and sequence it. Okay. And then they looked to see, what did we find? So one thing they found was great variation in how much melanin is skin in Africans. And that's shown, see how this, we've got these kind of blues, varying colors, okay? So there's variation, those are different populations, okay? And then they were able to identify, this is a picture showing that they found 4 groups of genes involved in skin color. So where did those genes come from and who has them? And that can tell us about the association of skin color and genetics. Well, guess what? You think it's a simple story? No, you know me better than that now. So here's an example of one of the genes they found called OCA. And so one form has a C in one location in the DNA, another form has a T. So they just mapped and counted these people. So do you see these funny little circles? They represent who has, what the proportion of the population is with the C's versus the T's. So I like this slide because I was here last spring in Botswana. And the San people are native in Botswana, and the Bantu people are now native in Botswana, but probably migrated there a couple hundred years ago or so. So see how this is mostly pink C's with a little bit of blue? This is mostly blue with a little bit of pink. So these are 2 African populations, okay? The San population actually genetically looks more like a population in Utah. So that's just one example of a gene. Other genes they saw went out of Africa to Europe and came back, or back and forth through the Middle East. So the author said there's so much diversity in Africans that there's no such thing as an African race, and that's the author of that study. I'm going to skip this. But it's a fun story. Actually, I'll just show you, this is how we're taught racism. Here's a picture on Wikipedia of lactose intolerance. See how Africa's like all blue? This is really where the phenotypes are. And see how in Africa it's there's white to blue within Africa? So we're taught, again and again, we want to think of the African continent as uniform, but it's not. Okay. And again, what Templeton says about the skin color thing is, depending upon which adaptive trait is chosen, one will get very different races. So we could have you could have genetic racial categories. They still wouldn't be the level of subpopulation. But you could say everybody who has this set of genes is in this group, and everybody who has that set of genes is in that group. You could do that. The problem is, there's no way to do that makes sense to us with how we use racial categories socially. And again, Templeton, it's not that we aren't different biologically, it's not that there's not different proportions of forms of genes in some different populations. It's just that it can't be defining, and nothing lines up with how we think about racial groups. So the last thing I want to talk about is why it matters. So on your white cards, okay, one person said they thought it might matter for health, okay, and that's a common misunderstanding. Or understanding, it depends. The misunderstanding is people think it matters because they might be more likely to have a particular gene or not. And that's why it matters to health. There's more misdiagnoses and bad medicine based on that. But it could be real in terms of maybe your likelihood to have a certain phenotype, because guess what? Living in America today, the way that people categorize you or race you as a verb can impact your phenotype. So it turns out that things like stress matter a lot biologically. If you're under chronic stress, there's things that happen about how your genes get expressed and how your body does its business. Okay? So there's not a genetic basis to racial categories, but that doesn't mean there's not a biological effect to being raced or racism. And there's some really interesting new studies about this. Here's a local one that I pulled. So this is a graph of birth weight. This is the percentage of low birth rate babies, and these are people raised as white or Latino mothers. Okay? And the Postville, many of you might remember the news when there was the immigration raid in Postville, Iowa, and For those of you who recall, you can think of the pictures in the news of people getting dragged away in handcuffs, families were separated. It was very traumatic. Even if you weren't involved, it was a traumatic thing to see. Okay? And if you identified as Latina, even if you weren't directly affected, it was likely traumatic to see. Okay? So they looked at a 37-week time frame in 1 year, and then they looked at the 37-week time frame after the post-Bill raid. And guess what? Preterm babies went up after the raid. So there's a biological effect of that. There's an interesting study they also did for women with Arabic-sounding names after 9/11. Analogous effect. So even though you might see different rates of things like hypertension, say in African Americans, it's not because there's a genetic difference. It's because it's a different lived experience. So, main take-home things. The phenotype or physical traits that you have are not the same as your genotype. Genotype is one element that can contribute to it, but it's also environmentally determined. Racial groups don't align with ancestry. The way that we use racial groups don't align with ancestry. Skin color doesn't determine race. And again, beware, the word race as a noun doesn't really mean anything. Unless you're talking about a product of racism, then a racial group might make a difference. I forgot which one works. Okay, hold on. So here's a book I'll recommend that really, these Karen Fields and Barbara Fields, their work really articulates this idea. There is no such thing as race. There is racism, and the myths embedded in the classificatory system of race, invented by intellectual racists and reproduced by policymakers, politicians, and circulated, naturalized, and normalized in socioculture discourses. I'll translate that. We are taught about race. There is racism and racecraft, so they call this racecraft, and definitely a biological impact of these practices, just as toxic as pollution impacts physical health of bodies. So I'm going to leave that up there while I get to a few of your questions. Okay. Does the term Anglo define any biological characteristics? No. Is the word Caucasian offensive, and should we use it? So this person was reading my slides, something I forgot to say. The person wrote, if you believe white people, I can't quite read this, especially without my glasses, most beautiful, quote, most beautiful by all means. So Blumenbach, looking back, people used Blumenbach's work then to create this whole, what I'll call race science, that a lot of our racism comes from, okay? Where they were measuring different body parts and saying, this is in this group, this is in that group, this is in that group, and then, you know, further look, that all went away, it didn't work, okay? But Blumenbach did have a fault, which he came up with Caucasian, you know, he kind of made it up, and he thought that was the most beautiful. So that's where his bias kind of came in. And so this person wrote, if you believe white people are the most beautiful. So, you know, I think it's kind of a judgment call. Is the word Caucasian offensive, and should we use it? I find the word Caucasian offensive not because not at you individually for using it, because I think a lot of people use it because they feel like it's polite, because it might be impolite to say white or black to them. But to me, when I hear the word Caucasian, it invokes all of this racial ideology that came out of Blumenbach's work. So I find it personally problematic. And I do think dancing around things, if you really, and if you can kind of buy into Fields' work and this idea of racecraft, if you're just really conscious, if you're talking about grouping people, just be clear what you mean. Saying something like race that has a meaning that shifts is hard, but if you can say, people who appear black to me in the US, okay, then I know what you're talking about, and we can be talking about the same thing. That's my advice. What kind of genetic research was done in Germany in the 1930s? Racist research. I will tell you a little bit historically. A lot of, another talk, a talk that I gave my students in Botswana about racial groups last spring, I talked about there's a lot of residue, shall I say, of eugenic thinking. Okay? And this is picking on the Nazis, but eugenics, this idea of better birth, right? That we want to make a better breed of people, if you will. So this idea didn't just come from Nazi Germany. It was popular in the US. There were eugenic societies. It was a thing. I've had well-meaning colleagues of mine, generally my parents' generation or older, who would tell me, people like you need to have more babies. And really what they meant, they saw me as a white, maybe intelligent person, okay? And so it was this kind of eugenic, who should be having babies, who shouldn't be having babies. And these eugenic ideas still remain with us. And there were like fitter family contests in the state fairs. I don't know if any of you remember that, where you would like evaluate this family. What did it mean to be a fitter family? That family is worthy of breeding, that family's not. A lot of the eugenic thinking, so the father of eugenics was Francis Galton, okay, who was Charles Darwin's cousin. Okay. And Galton was a statistician, and he loved using their family tree. The fact is, they had somebody who, in those days, would have been categorized as an imbecile in the family, and they just left that off the family tree. And we won't get on, there's also a lot of things about that eugenics comes through the man, and the woman's DNA don't have anything to do with it. So there's a lot of residue of eugenic thinking, and most genetics departments in the US today were founded as eugenics departments. Many of you might remember my beloved colleague Ken Christensen, who taught eugenics at Grinnell. So it was a very popular theory, again, that people who were fitter should breed, and almost literally breed, because they were kind of applying, we're saying, you know, like Galton's writings are like, well, we're doing such a good job on the farm, you know, we should apply this to people. But the ways that they categorized people and identified what traits they wanted were somewhat problematic. And a lot of the practices would have yielded not healthy populations in biological terms. Okay. Neanderthal, do Homo sapiens have some in their genes? So some modern day humans do have some Neanderthal genetic material. And so I had a picture of Pabo here. I wanted to make sure I got time for questions. Svante Pabo, P-A-A-B-O, is the leader in the field where he sequenced. Now we've been able to sequence DNA from some of these ancient human and our ancient extinct relatives. So that's kind of interesting to be able to compare sequences there. Will some trait like skin color change over generations based on location? So this is a complicated question. I think what the question is, people will talk about, if you take this group of people and put them in this environment, how long till they change the phenotype? So usually when people are thinking of this idea, they're thinking you're putting them in that location and there's no breeding with anybody who's there. So it's like a naive population. And then the idea is it depends on how strong the selective pressure is. Okay, so skin color, again, say darker skin color is associated with sun and being resistant to UV light, the mutations that can happen from UV light. And lighter skin is associated with being able to make vitamin D, which is harder to do in areas of lower level of sunlight. So I think you're thinking if you put one population one place and one the other, it depends on how strong the pressure is, how large the population is. There's kind of a lot of ifs there. Okay, other questions?
I'm not sure how much you want to get into. My name is Gene Bubbles. You have spoken different times about these genetic tests of characterizing the DNA. As sometimes you say finding this DNA sequence, and sometimes I heard you say markers, genetic markers. And which is it?
Okay.
And how do you actually tell? I think you do for these kinds of things. A full sequence of the DNA is probably not used, but you can tell most of the things that sites like Ancestry.com uses are markers. So would you tell us the difference?
Yes. So a marker is a region of sequence known to vary within the population. A marker is a specific sequence, a region of the genome, okay, a place on your chromosome, that's known to vary with the population. So they, and AIMS is what they're using as the acronym. Ancestral Informative Markers are DNA sequences associated with some varying frequencies in different populations. Does that answer your question?
How do you make the markers?
So first they have to be found, so that's a whole big thing. So you need to compare populations and say, is there a feature in this sequence that seems to be more predominant in one population than another population? And a lot of the complications happen with all the stuff that gets left out of there. So which components or which traits gets looked at? That's another whole talk that I'm not good enough to give, to be honest. An AIM is defined, right, in the ancestral informative marker, because it seems to be at a higher or lower frequency with some probability in one population versus another.
Can children of the same parents have different markers and be different genetically? I mean, how pronounced can that be?
Your children can have, so your children get kind of half of their DNA from you and half from their other biological parents. Okay. When the sperm and egg are formed, there can be a little bit of mixing up or recombination. And that's why we don't have exactly 25% from each grandparent. So there can be a little bit of recombination. And this is very sexy. This is the point of sex, really, is that you can mix up the DNA so that there's variation introduced into the genomes of the population so that, you know, you could have differences that might be worthwhile in different environmental conditions and things like that. Thank you. A good genetics question I can answer.
I know this is stupid, but is there therefore any real worthwhile reason to pay to have your genetic whatever?
It depends what your expectations are. There's a lot of ethical issues now, right, where it's been used in crime, where people haven't given permission. Most of them, I still think, ask you, like, they have the rights to your data. So that's something you might want to think about ethically if you want to give it out. I do think there is some validity to these. I think you have to think about you have to think carefully. Okay, so you will, and it has been very helpful to people, maybe if you're adopted or something, to want to know where some of your roots might be. They're probably right generally, but you have to be careful. And I do think as the sampling increases, I think they will get better and better. The fewer assumptions that are needed to be made. One of the problems is different systems use different markers, and some use slightly different analytical tools. And so it's hard to know. But the aims are interesting. And as Templeton said, it's not that there's no genetic variation among people. It just doesn't work around racial lines, and it's not to the degree of subpopulation.
One more question?
My sister got our test done last year and found that we're 50% Siberian Fin, that they have found two different groups in a very small country. And I was wondering, and also they had a percentage for Neanderthal now, so you can find that out. Is this an example of a phenotype difference in the two?
It's a difference in your genotype.
In the genotype, not...
Yeah. So you're measuring, when you're looking at the DNA sequence or whether you have a particular marker or not, that's a difference in the genotype.
Okay.
And again, like some of this is getting pretty good. They're able to map to a fine degree some locations and things. It is fascinating. I'm not dissing that whole industry. I'm just saying we need to kind of be careful about what it means. And know that it doesn't mean it doesn't associate along with our ideas of racial categories. I'm afraid we'll get sued if they put this on.
Maybe we have one more.
There's one right here.
So then, is there any good coming along with racial categories?
What's the question?
Is there anything good, or what do racial categories mean then?
So racial categories are a way to track discrimination based on racial categories. So there can be health impacts. There can be, somebody mentioned housing in their card. If there's housing discrimination going on, knowing what how somebody's categorized by society and where they live, you need to know that to track it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're very happy to have you here. So thank you all for coming, and remember to come back next week for the next class. Thanks a lot.